everyone, I welcome you to the CEC lecture series. I am Nupur Chawla, teaching English literature at Maitri College, Delhi University. This lecture is is the second part of the lecture on Aldous Huxley's short fiction or short story, that is The Bookshop. In the first part of the lecture, we discussed the background of the author, that how he is a British writer, 20th century. He has certain important features, characteristic features of his writing. That is, he is a pacifist. He wrote social satires. He also engaged with philosophical mysticism, right. Thereafter, we discussed that how the short story Bookshop is part of the short story collection, which was written in 1957, which is called the Collected Short Stories by Aldous Huxley. And the text, the Bookshop, is an important one for us to understand how a short fiction works, essentially how when it is limited in its scope, yet at the same time by using different techniques, literary techniques, it is able to convey so much in a short span. So, discussing that, we had looked at the plot of the story. We looked at the narration. We also looked at the language, and we figured that how each of these then contributes to the significance of what this text is trying to do. And the last point that we had made about language also tells us that it is one of the I would say distinguishing features of Huxley's writing, and that's what brings one back to his works time and again, that how his language is very suggestive, it is very visual, it is also at the same time very philosophical. So, in one or two sentences, he conveys so much that one has to stop and at times even read it twice to make sense of all that he packs in just a very small sentence, right. And the other thing that we also said was that how he has a very vast and a commendable imaginative sweep, where he connects something very mundane to that which is totally unrelated, and that's where the power of his writing also comes from. Now, in this part of the lecture, we are going to discuss what are some of the thematic concerns that come up in his short story, The Bookshop. Now, the first thing that we say is that the story is a comment on the degradation of society as the dry commercial ethic and the ordinary predominates. And it is the society is characterized by a lack of imagination and creativity. Now, you see, we must situate that why is Huxley, or what is making Huxley present such a society in his short fiction, which he wrote in 1957. Now, you see, he is writing at a time when the world has witnessed one war and is headed towards a second one, right. With this, we notice that how the society has been reduced to just the very basic level of sustenance, where the idea only is to survive, right. Either it is to survive or it is to combat, right. So, in such a situation, Huxley thinks about the fact that where are we headed as an entire civilization, where are those finer aspects that we as humans are kind of defined by, for instance love, for instance creativity, for instance imagination, for instance thoughts, ideas, dreaming, all of which makes us human and kind of distinguishes us from the other forms of life. All of that was missing at the time when he was writing. So, perhaps this is one of the ways one can say of Huxley to also criticize a world that goes to war, right? He's reminding us all those things that go missing when war predominates, right? Now let us see in the text that how do we see this comment on such a degradation of society. Now this first quote is where he's making a point about how in the society a bookshop was an anomaly, right? And I'll just quote that. He says, "One saw here that literature was a luxury. It took its proportionable room here in this place of necessity. Still, the comfort was that it survived, definitely survived." Unquote. Now, it's a marketplace, as we've discussed, which has all shops of necessity. But he says here that one saw that literature was a luxury. Now, this is a very important assertion here. Literature was a luxury. Can we think of literature as luxury today? When does it become a luxury? When just the other means of survival, when food, shelter become the bare necessities which are very, very important. When these necessities do not reach people, that's when literature becomes a luxury. Or it is also a luxury at a time when people have forgotten how to stay in touch with finer aspects of life because they are so busy in only the act of survival. So, talking about a bookshop in such a society is a very, very sharp critique on such times. And that's how subtly Huxley does this in his text, right? He uses the symbol of the bookshop, therefore, to criticize where the society was headed. He says that, literature here was a luxury and it took its proportionable room here in the place of necessity, right? So, necessity as against literature. The two stand contrasted. And he says, still, the comfort was that it survived. He says that even as the entire world was, engaged in just the necessities, just in fulfilling the bare minimum, facts of living, he says the fact that there was still at least one bookshop, it was a sense of comfort. That bookshop has survived these difficult times, right? So what do we see here? Huxley, once again, trying to bring back those values which were perhaps obliterated by this extreme circumstance of war. Let's look at this another quotation here, where this is what the bookshop owner also says. When he says that people are no longer interested in books, the business is not doing well, and nobody comes and buys books. And this is what he says. And I quote, "The ephemeral overwhelms the permanent, the classical. This journalism, this piddling quotidianism is the curse of our age." Unquote. Ephemeral, something which is here today, gone tomorrow. He says that this has now become the idea of the times. This is the value that now predominates. That people are no longer concerned with those ideas, those narratives which has stood the test of time, the permanent or the classical, right? All these books that were written far back in time, but they're still relevant today. People have no space for that. Instead, what is it that predominates? Quotidianism, he says, which means just the general, the ordinary, the everyday life. That is what people were choosing instead of engaging with those values, those narratives, those ideas which have stood the test of time. And he says this is the curse of our age. A curse, why? Because people have been dehumanized because of the result of the two wars, that they no longer are connected with ideas, imagination, and that's why this bookshop is suffering, right? So that's how we see that, just by means of these two sentences, Huxley is able to convey so much. A third quotation also tells us once again about Huxley's vision of the society. Here he is describing the surroundings and the kind of people which are there on the street, right? And let's look at this very interesting quotation. He says, and I quote, "The traffic ceaselessly passed, men and women hurried along with set faces, phantasms of horror, all of them. Outside, men lived under tyranny of things. Their every action was determined by the orders of mere matter, by money and tools of their trade, and the unthinking laws of habit and convention." Unquote. A longish quotation, but says too much. He says that men and women, they hurried along with set faces. Set faces, expressionless. No emotion on these faces. No sadness, no desire, no ambition, set faces, blank faces, right? They are referred to as phantasms of horror. Phantasm, ghosts, right? Horror of what, one should ask? Maybe the horror of the times, the horror of the wars, that how these people have been turned into mere ghosts. They are no longer humans. They do not have emotions. And they are only living, as he says over here, under the tyranny of things. They are just doing things for the sake of it. He says every action was determined by the order of the mere matter. Everything that they were doing was determined by either money or their jobs or the trade, or just by habit or convention. So it was, everything was a routine, without any break in that, without any conscious living, without any room for thought, reflection. And this stands sharply criticized in this quotation when the narrator observes the people on the street. So once again, what do we see here? Huxley, just by means of two sentences, he is able to convey so much through that, right? A second thing that we see conveyed in the text is that how romance, imagination, creativity and sensibility, they stand contrasted to the dominant values of the time. So he not only just criticizes the decadence, but at the same time he also creates room for sensibility, imagination and creativity. Let's see how. The foremost, of course, is that the bookshop itself is a symbol of the contrasting values. Let's see what he says. The narrator says, and I quote, "But here means in the bookshop, I seemed to be safe from things. Here, where an old man, an improbable survival from other time, indomitably played the music of romance." Unquote. Now, he says, the narrator says that it is in the bookshop. He says, I felt safe, right? In the bookshop where the old man was playing the piano and selling books, he says, as he played the music of romance. Romance in what sense? Romance in the sense of imagination, right? In the sense of the finer aspects of things. He says, this space I felt safe, right? This space seems to carry some promise that all these values are still not entirely dead. They might be struggling, but they are not gone, right? This is how he contrasts what his vision is and what the current reality of the times is. Let's look at this other quotation. He here once again comments on the bookshop owner, the old man. He says his aloofness, his culture, all a business trick. I felt aggrieved. He was just one of the common phantasms of horror masquerading as the angel of this somewhat comic paradise of contemplation. Unquote. Now, at one point, he also becomes doubtful of the old man as well, the old man, the bookshop owner. He says perhaps this aloofness, this sense of culture, this interest in books and piano and music, perhaps was nothing but a business trick, a trick to sell me a book. He says, I was aggrieved. I felt very sad. Perhaps that this old man was also one of the phantasms of horror, as he says, which means one of those people that he sees out on the streets were masquerading, but he was only masquerading as he says, an angel of comic paradise of contemplation. Very important phrase. Angel of the comic paradise of contemplation. Paradise of contemplation means what? Music, books, they make you contemplate. They make you sit, think, engage with ideas. And this for Huxley is a paradise, right? So he says that the narrator felt one with this kind of a value system, and he said that perhaps even the old man did belong to that universe, but he again had his doubt that perhaps it was just a business trick to sell the book. And but later then he corrects himself. He says that, and I quote, he was a reluctant inhabitant of the infernal realms, even as I was myself, unquote. Now look at these two words, reluctant inhabitant and infernal realms, which means what? That the old man and the narrator, both of them were at odds with their surroundings. Reluctant inhabitant, they had no other choice but to be there, but they were not living in those times by choice. They were not happy with those times. And how does he kind of describe those times? As infernal realms. Infernal, to do with hell, right? That's how he said that the times came across to him as. And we also see that the narrator therefore shares his dissatisfaction with the social drift when he contrasts these two value systems. One that is symbolized by the bookshop, one that he and the bookshop owner identify with, and the other is the one that they notice in the people outside of the shop, right? The other thing that we see is here in the story is that the post-war atmosphere is also evoked in the story very critically. And I quote, he says, outside, they were beginning to cry the evening papers. A ship sunk, trenches captured, somebody's new stirring speech, unquote. Again, all these are the features of the post-war times. A ship sunk, right? Perhaps, a reminder of the fact that how people are still fighting somewhere. Trenches captured. Trenches are dug during the war. Someone's new stirring speech. People are being, stirred into thinking or believing this side or the other. This is what was going on at the time when the atmosphere was of the wars, right? And we see here once again that this stands as a sharp contrast to what the bookshop stands for. Yet another thing that we see in this text which comes up is that the socio-political atmosphere of the times that is kind of created by Huxley, it inspires philosophical contemplation, right? Having critiqued these value systems, having contrasted them to the ideal that Huxley imagines, here then from here he moves into a certain philosophical contemplation, which again, as I was telling you in the beginning as well, is a very important part of Huxley's writing. I quote, he says, living is hard enough without complicating the process by thinking about it, unquote. Now this is towards the end, when he is convinced that the old man, that is the shop owner, is also of his kind, believing in art, contemplation, thought and ideas. But he says that it is just us two against this entire big world, and which is overwhelming, right? So that moment of, when he feels overwhelmed, he starts to think about the process of living. He says it's hard enough. So let's not complicate this process by thinking about it. He says if we think too much about life, about what's happening, why it's happening, it becomes still harder, right? But then do we say that Huxley doesn't want us to think? No. If Huxley was the person that does not want us to think, why would he at all create a story in the first place itself? But these are just some philosophical nuggets that he, I would say, peppers the story with. Let's look at this other quote where he once again, gives a philosophical stance on humanity. He says, and I quote, "The wisest thing perhaps is to take for granted the wearisome condition of humanity, born under one law to another bound, and to leave the matter at that, without an attempt to reconcile the incompatibles." Unquote. He says perhaps the wise thing is to take for granted that the condition of humanity is wearisome, it is tiring. That is just the truth. We are born under one law, which means that we are born with a certain set of conditions, but ultimately we get bound to just the opposite set of conditions, right? We are born with certain value systems. We are born with certain, things which make us human. For instance, this ability to think, admire, dream, etc. But as we live life, other values start to predominate. He says these are two incompatibles, right? These are two aspects of human life. One is rational, hard fact oriented, goal oriented, and the other is dreamy, imaginary, creative, imagination oriented, creative, philosophical, thoughtful, intuitive, etc. He says these are two incompatibles, and any attempt to reconcile these is difficult. Once again, a philosophical question, right? He says that there is no point to make the two ends meet. But let's understand that Huxley is not leaving us without hope, right? He is raising an important concern, and that is where his job as a writer is a success. He's making us think about these aspects of life and society of the time, right? So with these two quotations, the story comes to an end, right? So we notice therefore that in this short fiction by Huxley, some of the important points come through. The first one is that Huxley is the voice of imagination, contemplation and thought in the post-war world that has forgotten the graces of human life. Second, we see that he attempts to bring back the finer aspects of life that perhaps got decimated in the aftermath of the two world wars. Third, he also has the courage to reimagine life and remind the generation about the need to recalibrate and get back in touch with essential aspects of life, which is humanity, creativity, dreaming, thought, intuition. All of which is symbolized in the bookshop, the books and the music in the story. Fourth, we say that Huxley does not have ready answers to how do we reconcile these two aspects of life, and he leaves the story with an open-ended thought. But this text definitely makes a dent in reminding people of that which should be aspired for, right? So this short story, even as spans a few pages, but because of the very enabling literary techniques used by Huxley, it makes these important points. It not only presents to us a view of the society of the time, kind of bringing up important questions of the time, but at the same time raising some crucial philosophical concerns as well. I would say that this is the charm of Huxley's writing, that the text lingers in your head. It stays with you even after it has ended. I hope that you understood the story The Bookshop well, and this should encourage you to read other texts by Huxley and experience what a great writer that he was. Thank you.